We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
My name is Henry John Hayes. I was born on Easter Sunday, the 12th of April, 1925. I was born in Poole, Dorset, Poole Infirmary Hospital, Dorset, and went to school at Heatherlands in Upper Parkston, which is an outskirts of Poole. Did normal primary schooling, and then my family moved to Bournemouth, and I worked for the electric supply company until I decided it was all my friends were joining up, so I decided I'd do the same thing. It wasn't necessary because I believe it was I don't think I would have been called up because it was a safeguarded job, being a service job. Anyway, I went up to the recruiting office, unknown to my parents, and volunteered my services. And the next thing was I had a letter from Southampton telling me to report up there for a medical. My parents were horrified, naturally, but the deed was done, and I passed all the necessary things that I had to. We were also given tests, assembling various tools and that to see what you were capable of doing. And then went back home, and then the next thing was a letter telling me to report to Bovington in Dorset, Bovington Camp in Dorset, on the 18th of March 1943. And from once I got to Bovington, that's when life started in earnest. I didn't realise what I'd let myself in for, but there we are. I took it as it came. We were all in the same boat, and I joined 30 Primary Training Wing at Bovington Camp, and spent 6 weeks there doing drill, camouflaging, observation work, mainly infantry stuff. And then when we passed out after 6 weeks, we marched down to the bottom of Bovington Camp to the 58th Training Regiment, which was Royal Armoured Corps. And from there on, we started training in earnest. We start off with, we had 2 more weeks of drill, and then we started on the tank crew courses. A month was spent on learning how to drive a wheeled vehicle, because I was unable to drive before that. And then in that month's period, we were also trained on tanks. The tank I learned to drive on was a Crusader Mark VI, and it was an eye-opener altogether. Once the driving and maintenance course was finished, we then went onto wireless, and we were told, because signalling by flags was then going out, and the radio as such was just coming into being. So it was a case of learning various things about the electrics and how to tune in a radio set, which was the number 19 set at that time. Once that month was over, we then went to Lulworth in Dorset, where the Rangers were, and trained on gunnery, on 2-pounders and 6-pounder guns, also 3-inch. It was quite a time of learning altogether. Then once the month was over of gunnery, and we'd fired all the weapons at various ranges, we then went back to Bovington camp itself, to the main training regiment, and did a month on what was termed as collective training, where we put into being all that we'd learnt on driving, wireless and gunnery, on various exercises, one against the other and as a group. And at the end of that month, we then passed out on the parade ground and were posted to our various regiments. Before that, we've been interviewed as to which regiments we were like to go to. Well, I'd already stated I wanted to be posted to the Royal Armoured Corps, and at the time of the interview, I was undecided which regiment I wanted to go to because of my age. Certain regiments were only taking people of certain ages. I had the offer of going to the 4th, 7th Royal Dragoon Guards, which I accepted. I was earmarked to go to officer training, which I said I didn't want. I didn't want to be an officer. I wanted to be a trained other rank. This wasn't taken very seriously, but never mind. I had my way, and I finished up in Heveningham camp near Hellsworth in Suffolk, where I joined my regiment. When we went to first, did the driving and maintenance month's course, we started to drive on wheeled vehicles. I was given a Morris Commercial, which when you rev the engine up, the bonnet flaps lifted. It was a bit disconcerting, but you sort of operated by the noise of what was going on. Then when we came to training on cross country, it was a Guy make of vehicle, 1500 weight classed as, which had much bigger wheels for rolling across country. And then when we took our driving tests, believe it or not, we had brand new we had brand new Bedford MW 1500 weights, which you could hardly hear the engines running, which made life rather difficult, particularly when you're worried about passing a driving test. Nevertheless, I passed the driving test, and that was it.
43, isn't it?
This would be June 43, I should think.
Okay, so there's quite a bit.
It was 6 weeks at the PTW, and then 2 weeks square bashing, and then started the driving training for a month, and a month's wireless, and a month's month's gunnery, finishing up with a month's collective training. The rifle training we did very little of. Being in the Royal Armoured Corps, we did do route marches to the ranges, and did a certain amount of rifle training, but it was a lesser thing than going into the Royal Armoured Corps knowledge. Learned to drive. My first tank was a Crusader Mark 6 with a 6-pounder gun. The instructor sat on the outside of the tank, which was rather worrying. You were inside it, all enclosed, and you were going cross country, hoping that he could hang on without being thrown off. It was a bit worrying, but nevertheless, I managed all right. Social life was very nearly non-existent, because there was your own cleaning of kit had to be done, which had to be absolutely perfect. The barrack rooms had to be spotless all the time. On top of which, you only had 3 shillings a week pay, 3 shillings a day pay, which was equivalent of 21 shillings per week, of which you could only draw £1. 1 shilling had to be left behind for barrack room damages, as usual, but so that you couldn't afford to go to the canteen spending much money. So if you did go to the local naffy, you just had a cup of tea and maybe the odd packet of biscuits. That was all you could afford to do. Otherwise you'd run out of money before the week ended, and you were only paid once a week. Weekend leave was, if you could get, you put a pass in. If it was okay, fair enough. Living in Bournemouth, I only had 30 miles to go home. So I was able to go home at most weekends, which wasn't very well looked on by my friends, because they had much further to go. Where I could go home, they couldn't. We knew nothing, absolutely nothing of what was happening or where we were going. Because when I joined the regiment in Suffolk, unknown to me, I found out that we had swimming, or 2 squadrons were being trained on swimming tanks, which to me was something unknown. It was highly secret. You weren't allowed to talk to anybody about it, and you signed the Secrets Act to make certain that you didn't disclose any information. I did a certain amount of training, but as I was spare crew and only a trained young soldier, I was unable to actually become a part of a tank crew. So I was given the odd jobs to do, fatigues and such, like cookhouse duties and things like that. And you also worked your ordinary army days in between. Although I was not a DD swimming tank crew member, I was taken on the odd exercise for experience. It was horrific. I've never been so frightened in my life. The tanks are loaded on backwards onto tank landing craft, and then set off to sea, to wherever you're going. And when the time comes to offload, the front hatch is dropped, which slopes down at about 45 degrees, and the tank is then moved forward to, because on that ramp or hatch there is an attachment which fits the tracks of the tank, so that when the tank drives off to enter the water, it engages in this attachment, and you very, very slowly go down this 45 degrees till you hit the water. And while you're going down, you're wondering how long it's going to be before the tank comes up. Finally, you breathe a sigh of relief when the front end of the tank suddenly pops up and you're free then. You then engage the propellers and head for shore. On this particular exercise, we motored about 3-4 miles off of Studland, past Swanage, Studland, and then to where the beach where the exercise was taking place. We hit sand, still in water, but we hit firm ground, and as was the practice, we released the front screen so that it collapsed and motored on a bit, and within seconds we were in a bomb hole because there'd been bombings there. The tank just sank, and we were in our places, sat in position, struggling to get out. I managed to get out, soaking wet, and suddenly realised that because I was riding in the co-driver's seat, my driver, he was struggling, he couldn't get out. So I opened his hatch and pulled him out, dragged him out, and got him out, and then we had to make hell and all speed to get to shore because rocket firing boats were following up the exercise, and we had to get clear of the beach. It was a very frightening experience altogether. Well, having trained on driving, and when the invasion was coming up, little did we know that my squadron, which was B squadron, finished up in Fawley Wood near Kelshot on Southampton Water. We just lived rough. We had nothing except the clothes we stood up in. And then one day, all of a sudden, the new Sherman tanks arrived. They came direct from America. They came in, I believe, at Cardiff, and were driven on transporters. They were all boxed up, believe it or not. Only just the tracks were visible, and they were steered by 2 cables out through the smoke discharger hatches, which was very hit and miss, but it was the only way of doing it. And then when the tanks finally were offloaded, we had to strip off all this wood and uncover them all together. They in turn were completely and utterly greased up because of the sea journey. So we had hours of work to do to get all the grease out of the guns and everywhere else on the tanks and do maintenance on them. Then once that was done, we took them down into the sea and sat in about 6 foot of water to see if there were any leaks. If there were, you start from square one to find out where the leak came from and cleaned it up, sealed it again and tried again until you got things perfect. We just had other opportunities to drive because being so secret, they were not allowed out into the open. But once the invasion was close and we didn't know it, all us spare people who weren't in tank crews were all gathered together all of a sudden and told, pack your kit, and we were taken down to Portsmouth, Fratton Park, which I believe is the football ground. And from there, you were given the job of sealing tanks. And with what knowledge you had, you were able to move the vehicles about from one place to another. And once all the tanks were sealed, we then started on the B vehicles, as they were called, the wheeled vehicles, and we sealed those. It was all good training in a way because you learned to drive so many different vehicles. It was hit and miss in a way because it was a good job you didn't take them out onto the road, but you certainly gained experience of handling them. Then when we loaded up the vehicles onto we moved from Portsmouth down into the docks, and it was one massive long convoy of vehicles. We didn't know where we were going or what we were doing. The previous night to that move, we'd been given French francs, which indicated possibly we were going to France, but this could have been a complete blind. But anyway, we moved down into the docks. The actual invasion, unknown to us, was put back 24 hours because of bad weather, and we finally loaded up onto the tank landing craft and set off down or out into the channel and formed up masses of shipping. There were so many boats there, it was unbelievable. And then all of a sudden, somebody gave the order to move, and we were on our way. We still didn't know where we were going. And it was only when we after some hours at sea, in bad weather, with waves breaking over the landing craft, the weather was so bad we couldn't cook any meals. So we had meals, made our meals in the tanks, which consisted of tins of soup. Because fresh food, you couldn't be cooked. And then when we got over we realised we were heading for Normandy. And while we were off the beach at Normandy, we got stuck under the stern of a massive, huge transport ship. We think possibly it had broken down, and it had been caught by the tide, and we were caught by the tide. We finished up under its stern, and once we got free of it, after about 2 or 3 hours, most likely because the tide turned, we managed to get ashore and waded in, and then made our way inland. In a tank crew, you've got one cooker, and you've got your dixies, and you share your food out in the dixies for cooking, and using the little tank cooker. But during the invasion, we couldn't use any cookers, so all we had was these tins of soup. You just flipped off the lid in the top of the, or a little cap in the top of the tin, and you put a lighted cigarette end to the little stub inside, and this in turn heated the soup up. It was a wonderful idea, and that's what we lived on for a couple of days. Just pure soup. Bear in mind that being spare crew, I wasn't a member of a tank crew, so I was a spare bod. The 2 squadrons of the regiment, B and C, were swimming tanks. A squadron and headquarters were normal tanks, standard. The swimming tanks, of course, they swam in from out a few hundred yards out at sea, because it was so rough. They tried to get them in as close as possible. We were lucky enough with the landing craft to get into the beach and just got into deep water. I wasn't in a DD tank for the landings. The DD tanks were only used basically for the actual initial landing. Once they'd got ashore, the DD part of the tank was a bit of a menace, because it gave extra width to the vehicle and was also a danger to everybody, and it was of no use. So as and when it was possible, they were cut off.
No, because I thought Dad came ashore in a tank, but he didn't. You came ashore on foot?
No, on tank.
You were on a tank?
Yeah.
And it was a duplex tank.
I was, yeah, we were following up with spare tanks as replacements.
Okay.
So that as and when we got up to an area which was suitable, as and when regiments wanted tanks replaced, we took them up to them, handed them over, then went back and prepared more tanks. We lost a lot of tanks. The Americans lost a huge quantity of their swimming tanks because they tried to offload in very, very rough water, and as soon as they came off, they just sunk. The tank only had a swimming tank only had about 2 foot of freeboard, so the waves would splash over the top, and you couldn't afford to take on too much water, otherwise you put the whole thing out of balance. And they worked on the Archimedes principle that a vessel in water displaces its own weight, I think the statement goes. But it was a very primitive idea, but it was a wonderful one. And a swimming tank, when it was in the water, looked just like a small boat, except for the fact that you couldn't see a gun or anything. It was just an object in the water, which was just, as I say, just like a boat.
Did you have to practice bailing out the canvas sides when you were training?
I wasn't involved in that. It was done before my time, but they did went up to a lake in Norfolk where a tank turret was sunk in a lake in a deep hole, and crews had to go down into this turret. It was filled with water, and then they used the ex-submarine apparatus to bail out and get back to the surface. It's a frightening thing altogether. I think somewhere about midday it would be that we landed. Things were reasonably quiet, and we made our way along the beach for a little way, and then we were directed to a gap in the promenade which had been made, and we through this gap climbed up through it and then made our way inland for a few miles. I think we finished up somewhere about maybe a couple of miles from Bayeux, because we were when we were given some spare time, we walked into Bayeux and had a look around. I was driving then.
So
yeah.
you were the driver,
Yeah.
driving the tank off on D-Day.
Well, it was.
What was that experience like when it was your turn?
Well, you were just worried. You were down inside, the hatch closed. You were driving using your periscopes, so you couldn't see anything. Obviously, the noise of the engine is considerable because it's an air-cooled radial engine on the basic tank, and you don't hear anything. You just keep going and just hope for the best. You don't talk more than you've got to because of incoming messages.
Because I know that there's two circuits. There's internal, and then, as you say, on the 19 set.
Yeah, the 19 set is three-way.
Yeah. Okay. So there's no. You weren't trying to use any kind of humour to try and take off the tension. You weren't.
Oh no, you didn't dare do that because you'd be blocking off any information that was coming into you.
You have got one radio operator in your tank.
Oh yes.
Dedicated. So
Yeah, but he would control it.
He could control incoming to
Yeah.
internal.
Yeah.
Okay.
And were you all roughly the same age at that time in your crew?
Possibly the rest of the lads were maybe a little bit older, but yes, very, very roughly about the same age. So we'd all be about 18 years old.
Very young.
Yeah.
Mm.
And you were out at sea. You landed. You came off at sea, didn't you, Dad?
Yeah.
I thought the training was done at sea, but I thought on Gold Beach you landed on the beach.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I was then, yes. Yeah.
The
So they came right in.
Yeah, so the periscope is just the name for the viewfinder.
Right.
The tank is not physically. It wasn't underwater.
Right.
It just
No.
it's just called a periscope.
Right.
Okay.
No, when the swimming tanks had big extended periscopes, they were about 5 foot long. So you could see over the screen.
I don't suppose you ever met General Hobart, who designed or invented the.
Not that I know of. No. I remember seeing Montgomery up in Scotland. when he talked to all the troops that were obviously going to be in the invasion.
What was your impression, although maybe at a distance, what was your impression of Montgomery?
Impressive, I should think. It was an impressive way of speaking. You got taken in, if that's the right term, but which is of course what was wanted, to gain confidence.
What were your? I know some of the questions you were asked when we were in France was, what were your feelings on D-Day? Weren't they? What were your emotions?
Just frightened.
You were 19, weren't you?
Yeah, I was 19 years old. It was a new situation altogether. You were completely unprepared for.
I take it you knew there was gunfire, bombing, and all of that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you fully expected that.
Yeah.
But
so what was your outlook? What did you see when you landed?
Well, you just took cover and looked after yourself. It was a case of every man for himself. No, never saw any civilians at all. Whether they'd been removed or they'd fled because of the battle, I don't know. But I never saw any civilians at all. There was 5 men in each tank, because the 17-pounder gun hadn't come into service then, and the 75mm Sherman was a 5-man crew, which was a driver, a hull gunner, wireless operator, gunner and commander. But when the 17-pounder gun came in, you lost the hull gunner because they put more ammunition in its place. Whether they only came in 1 per troop, so it was 3 tanks to a troop. So you lost 1 Sherman and replaced with a Sherman Firefly. And of course the Germans, if they could, went for the Firefly instead of the normal Sherman. The normal Sherman was hopeless against German tanks. The 75mm gun wasn't very clever at all. Where the 17-pounder could really knock out German tanks. We would be travelling maybe 10 miles behind. With all these reserve tanks, there was tanks, armoured cars, there was a wild assortment of vehicles which were all ready for replacement. I mean, maps that were issued, of course, only went to the commanders. You couldn't have that, every man or every person having a map. So you didn't really know where you were going. Well, from there on, it was just a case of follow my leader. You just kept moving because the whole front was on the move all the time. So you never stayed at any one place at any time at all. It was sleeping rough under canvas, under a bivouac next door to a vehicle. We cooked for ourselves, yeah. Rations were issued each day, mainly in cardboard boxes. M&V, yeah. M&V. I consider the standard of the 24-hour packs were rather good. There was certainly enough. And what any one person didn't like, another one did. So we used to swap and change around. Oh, the hardtack biscuit was hardtack, there's no doubt about that. They were really hard biscuits that wanted soaking in your mug of tea. to soften them up. Breakfast was a dried scrambled egg and a tin sausage. You didn't see a lot of the locals. There was one place where we stopped, and we wanted some water to drink. Obviously, water you couldn't just take it out the river or anything like that. That was dangerous. So we went to this farmyard, and then he came out with a drink for us. Little did we know it was Calvados, and it was absolute fire water. So we only had just a sip of that, and I had to make do. I wasn't involved in the actual fighting, although we saw the signs of it, and also all the time, once we started moving in Normandy, moving inland, the streams of prisoners coming back, they just had the clothes they stood up in, no equipment, and they'd been deluded of all their equipment, and all they had was their clothes, and they were making their way back to base where they were put into prisoner of war camps. There was hundreds and hundreds of them. It was dangerous to park up anywhere where buildings were, but you never knew if there was anybody still around that was going to take a pot shot at you. So you endeavoured wherever possible to keep to the open. Oh yeah, there was always the odd sniper that got left behind, but they didn't last for long. As a unit, we were that far behind. We had no infantry with us at all. The infantry were all with the main forward regiments. Being an armoured regiment or an armoured brigade, as we were on call to move from one unit to another to support them. Although again, as I say, I wasn't in a tank crew, so I wasn't with the main part of the regiment. But as the regiment moved, so the supporting units behind them, they had to move at the same time. Any vehicle that was available, who wanted a driver. Most of the time I spent in the first month anyway was driving a tank, be it a Sherman or a Kangaroo. Kangaroo is a Sherman without a turret, and the open part of the tank with the turret removed was for carrying infantry. One way of getting troops from one point to another in reasonable safety.
What vehicles were in your troop?
Well, in the regiment had Austin 3-ton trucks. Firstly, there were 4x4 trucks. That's about it. By that time we were up into Belgium, Holland, and it was hard. The object of the exercise there was to get into a farmyard and sleep with the cows. It was the warmest place to find. But of course the farmers were worried sick that somebody was going to light a cigarette up. And that was, of course, a huge danger. But you kept an eye on each other. Yes, I was smoking at the time. Well, because you were issued with 50 cigarettes a week in a tin. And they were free. And that was it. but I didn't smoke a lot. At times we used if there was food we didn't or tin food that we didn't particularly like, we'd pass it over to the farmers and get eggs and potatoes from them in exchange, which helped.
I know you said some story about you saw from a distance Hamburg being bombed, didn't you?
Oh yeah,
that
that was way up.
Yeah,
I have looking at that map. I have serious doubts about whether it was Hamburg. It was because if we only went up as far as Bremerhaven, I don't know what was in that area. Most likely it could have been Bremerhaven. I don't know, which is not. I don't know where Hamburg is on situated with. It's obviously in that area because it's Hamburg is on the Rhine, and the Rhine is up in the top corner of that map. So it wasn't far from there.
So do you remember crossing the Rhine?
Yes. On a ferry boat. The Rhine was crossed with DD tanks, but the another regiment did it and got established on the other side. It was amazing how wide it was. It was certainly wider than the Thames, and it was quite a journey across. And I mean, when you're in I was with wheeled vehicles then, and you just sat on a pontoon being towed across a wide river. You're a sitting duck. It was reasonably safe to cross. It obviously had to be, because otherwise your vehicles would have been lost no end. I know I crossed the Seine at Vernon, but I don't know where it was on the Rhine. I know we formed up in a wooded area, waiting to cross till it was safe. I think I did after, I think about fortnight, maybe 3 weeks in France. I had a bite on my cheek, and that turned nasty, and I finished up with impetigo, and it was all up in my head, all over my face, all up in my hair, and it was an awful mess. And in the end, I was sent back to base hospital, and I spent 10 days there while they, the original first aid unit covered my face with gentian violet, which is a horrible cream stuff. But when I went down to base hospital, they cut all my hair off, shaved my head, and then put sulfamolamide cream on, and that did the trick. It cured the bug, and after about 10 days, I was discharged. But that was when I lost my regiment. I got sent back to the wrong unit, and I was travelling in the wrong formation, and I finished up in Brussels, and that was an experience on its own. But and then after a lot of chit chat and asking questions, I was sent back to base again and started off afresh in the right lines of information, and got back to my regiment again. But then the unit, the odd bod unit I was with, that had been disbanded, so I stayed with the regiment then, and I was nominated to and given a truck to drive. So I was quite happy. During the war, I was in constant contact with my family by mail. When I went back to base with the Impetigo, I lost contact with them. I was getting no mail, but they were getting mine. I couldn't tell them from the secrets point of view where I was, except the fact that I was all right. But they contacted SAFA and various social groups to try and find out where I was and find out how I was. But it was a bit of an awkward situation. But once I got back with the regiment, I caught up with all my mail, and found its way back to me, and that was it. We entered Brussels. There was masses of people on the streets. I got a black eye through, I think it was an apple or something like this, thrown up at us. It was absolutely amazing.
So no drink, wine or beer, they were throwing fruit at you?
No, we didn't go for have drinks. You couldn't afford to drink and drive.
Oh, I didn't think you'd mind if you were driving in convoy through a liberated town.
Christmas, we were up in Holland. Christmas '44. It was snow everywhere. In fact, we whitewashed the tanks to camouflage them, because being a dark green, they stood out like mad. And so there was only one thing for it, to we whitewashed them. Seems stupid, but that was it. It was a case of safety. And it even set fire to the tracks because they froze to the ground and we couldn't move them. The one thing that always stands out in my mind is the masses of prisoners coming back. There was just one long stream of them. They had no escort. They had no weapons of their own because they'd all been taken away from them. And they were just slowly making their way back to base. So they had some miles to walk. But they were just completely distressed. There's no doubt about that. It was a beaten army. Not really. If I remember rightly, VE Day I spent with the Remy unit. I had a broken down truck. The truck I was driving was a 1500 weight Fordson, and they couldn't understand why the engine was as rough as it was. And then we suddenly realised, or somebody realised, that one of the valve seats had blown out. And so I was towed around behind a Scamel, and it was at VE Day when I heard that the war had ended, and that was it then. Everybody was happy,
Yeah.
but we were still abroad, and we didn't know what was happening to us or what was going to happen to us. So it was a completely unknown situation.
Did you have were you given leave? Did you have a party? Did you celebrate?
No, we had no parties, no leave, no nothing. Uniform. Well, Up there, there's me when I first joined the regiment, the 4th, 7th. There's a picture of me there. We're normally driving, you were in overalls. Usually they were two-piece, but if you could get hold of a tank suit overall, which was all in one, all to the good. But they weren't waterproof or anything, so you still had to keep yourself dry. Footwear, but black boots. Only had two pair. One had to be highly beezed up, highly polished for special parades. The other ones you wore for work and everything. No, being Armoured Corps, hobnail boots were not allowed to be worn. We did when we first started, and they were dangerous, as you can imagine, on board a tank. But there's an order came out that all hobnails had to be removed, which saved a lot of problems. But I used to write every other day, send a letter back. And I was just trying to describe places, particularly in France, because my father had been there in the 1418 war. And I was trying to describe places like Amiens, Arras, Lille, and places like that, where I knew he'd been, because he was in the tank corps. But I didn't know precise places where he'd been. So it was only the areas. And he'd only mention them because he would never talk. I could never get him to talk about war. Because 1918, he was awarded the military medal. And I tried hard to find out how he got it. And his only answer was he got a cookhouse for the boys, which is a stock answer sort of thing. But after he died, and I met an old comrade of my then regiment, and he said he had a Roll of Honour book of the Royal Tank Corps, and if he could find details, he would send them to me, which he did. And I found out it was a place near Amiens that he'd got it. A tank had broken down and was being fired on, and he just walked out to the tank, got it going, and it motored off back into battle again, and he got the MM for it. So I've got his citation tucked away in the family history.
That's fantastic. Did you know your granddad had a military medal?
I knew he had a citation, but you haven't got great-granddad's medals, have you?
No.
No, there was a family dispute and they went in the coffin.
No.
You can get replacements.
My brother wanted them and I wanted them. And rather than, it was a bad time, and rather than a huge argument, I said, right, in the box. The funeral people were coming to seal the box up. So I put them in there and that was it. I regret it now that I didn't persevere, perhaps. I spent my time in Germany with the 4th, 7th Dragoon Guards, and then when the war ended, we'd moved back to the Dutch border, and I caught glandular fever. It was unknown then just what it was, and I finished up. I just barely remember being carried out from the billet where we were staying, which was a school, and I was moved back and back and back, and I finished up in Ostend, in base hospital, and then from there I was moved to Basingstoke, a hospital there, then to Bournemouth, my hometown, and then to a convalescent depot in Bournemouth for 6 weeks, and then moved from there to Taunton to a convalescent depot there, where I was singled out by a sergeant major and asked to work in the sergeant's mess. I said, "Not on your likely. I'm not waiting on other people." He said, "Come on," he said, it's worth your while. So I said, "All right, I'll give it a go." So I finished up in the sergeant's mess as a waiter, and during that period, I learnt that my regiment was back home in the UK and was on its way to go into Palestine, and I wanted to get back to them. So I made lots of applications to rejoin my regiment. They worked in the end. I got back to the regiment, who were back at Heveningham again in Suffolk, and I spent a little while with them, and then my paperwork to travel with them to Palestine never got through, and I finished up being posted to Catterick, and I spent best part of a month in Catterick. Horrible place, being a depot, and was posted to the 4th Hussars in Italy, in Trieste. That was quite a trip, going to or getting to Trieste. No such thing as flying. There was a military train daily went from Calais to towards Trieste area. It carried on afterwards. I don't know where it finished up. It was called the Medlock route, Mediterranean location train, and we travelled right way down through to Austria, travelling overnight, day and night. No windows in the train, so you can guess it was not very comfortable. Packed in like sardines. The train trip was by steam train across Europe, and then when we got down to Austria, we stayed at Graz, and from there picked up a diesel train which took us down to Trieste, and then the regiment itself, they were on exercise, but they're based at Villa Opicina, and on the top of the hills overlooking Trieste. So that was where we went, and it was quite an occasion. It was also obviously that the weather was good, so it was more enjoyable. But when we got to to Opicina, we were sleeping on stone floors, which wasn't very comfortable. That was it. We had to make the best of it. I stayed with the 4th Hussars for the rest of my service, but we moved when the regiment reformed in Trieste, or gathered together what there was of it, because DMOB was in force then, and numbers were running down. A lot of the members were posted to units in Palestine, I was held back because I was then doing technical work. Because when I went to the regiment in Trieste, I was listed as a driver, and I finished up being given a truck that never moved. It was a store truck. On top of which there was problems with it. Never mind. I took an interest in what was involved, and the stores were in a cellar nearby, scattered all over the place. I've never seen anything like it, and I took on the job of sorting it out, and I rebinned this particular truck. I was given some catalogues, and I've got the stuff all together and sorted it all out, and that must have stood me in good stead, because they held on to me. And the next thing, the remains of the regiment, about 30 of us at that time, moved to Lubeck with the vehicles that were left. I think it was about 8 vehicles we had left in the regiment. We moved to Lubeck. It was a very wet winter, and we couldn't get direct there because of floods, and we went through the American zone and had to spend time there. They looked after us, but in the end we got up to Lubeck, and the regiment was reformed there with the help of infantry people. And then from there, the regiment moved back to Colchester, where we reformed with a lot of Polish men. They'd taken Scottish nationality and signed on to get the nationality. They'd signed on for a period of 3 years, run regular service. So they were ideal to come with us on our move from Colchester out to Malaya. And we spent 3¼ years in Malaya. And then we came home from Malaya that was from 1948 to 1951. I got married in 1952 because I met my wife in Colchester, and we corresponded in the 3 years I was abroad. When we got home, within the month, we got married by special license, and then managed to get a quarter at Tidworth, where the regiment settled down. And the next thing, we moved to Germany then. We spent 8 years in Hona, in the same barracks. We moved quarters 3 times as my family increased, and it was quite a long spell. It was unknown. And then we came home from Hona, gathered ourselves together, and within the year we're on our way to Aden. And we spent a year in Aden. I was on the advance party to Aden, was posted to Sea Squadron, and went with them to Sharjah in the Persian Gulf, and had the job, my sole job was to get the spares together for the squadron to be independent. And I spent 6 months in Sharjah before I applied to come back to Aden to spend time with the family. And then while I was in Aden, I applied for a home posting, and I got a posting to Bovington, to the equipment trials wing, which dealt with experimental vehicles. And that was when I was demobbed in 1965. I decided that, although I still had time to go, I decided I'd had enough, because it meant the regiment again were moving out to the Far East again. And if I take my family with me, particularly my eldest daughter, who was then coming up 11 years old, she would have had to go to a boarding school. And my wife, having been in a boarding school in India during the war, or just before the war, hated it. So I decided I could take into account all my service and claim my 22-year pension, which I did. And so I came out on my birthday in 1965. And that was the end of my army career.
Okay, Jan, anything you think that he skipped over that you in your mind knows that he's missed on that bit?
Only that we, as we left Faramonch on the Friday, we took a different route out and saw a brown sign saying 4th, 7th Dragoon Guards Memorial, so we headed for that. And in a little village of Cruelli, I think it's pronounced, and his regiment liberated that village, and so that's hence the memorial. We got out, paid our respects, and Dad's pointed out that he knew several of the people on the memorial. Yeah, and we said, did you liberate this this village? Were you on it? And he said he didn't know, because there were no road signs, nothing. They didn't know village signs. They didn't really know where they were. I suppose it was grid reference or something, was it, Dad, in those days? So he doesn't know whether he was.
I mean, maps that were issued, of course, only went to the commanders. You couldn't have that, every man or every person having a map. So you didn't really know where you were going.
Do you want to reference the cemetery that you came across for the 4th, 7th Dragoon Guards? Do you want to just reference coming across that? When you can say when we were in Normandy the other day, we came across the cemetery.
It was a cemetery. It was just a memorial.
It was just a big brick memorial. What was it, about 20 yards long, wasn't it?
Yeah, something like that, Dad. Yeah, with a lot of names.
2 great big plaques on it with all the names on there.
For the camera, if you could say we came across a memorial, and then explain from there, please.
Of your 4th, 7th Dragoon Guards, Dad.
We were making our way back to our base, and we saw this sign which said 4th, 7th Royal Dragoon Guards Memorial, and we decided that we would have a look at it, considering I'd been a member of the regiment. And when we got to it, we were amazed at how nice it was. There'd obviously been a service held there, because there were all the memorial wreaths and everything was still on the ground in front of it. But it was very, very interesting. Although they included some from 1940 days, because the regiment had been at Dunkirk. Well, thank you for this interview. I hope you'll be able to put the pieces together, although they're a little bit disjointed. I hope everything will sort itself out. Goodbye.
Bless all the sergeants and WO1s. Bless all the corporals and their thinking sons, 'cause we're saying goodbye to them all, as back to their billets they crawl. you'll get no promotion this side of the ocean. So cheer up, my lads, bless 'em all.
Bless 'em all.